Was history rewritten? Is there evidence hidden in plain sight within the ancient pages of the Bible that points to the original Israelites being a black people? For most of my life, that question would have sounded like a fantasy, a fringe conspiracy whispered in the forgotten corners of the internet. The history I knew was solid, immutable, taught in the hushed reverence of Sunday school, and reinforced by every majestic painting and stained glass window I had ever seen. The prophets, the apostles, the Messiah himself, they were all cast from the same mold, with flowing brown hair, fair skin, and eyes that held a distant European sorrow. They looked nothing like me. My name is Elias. I was raised in a small, devout church where faith was the bedrock of our community. It was a comfort, a shield against a world that often felt cold and indifferent. But even in that warmth, a quiet dissonance hummed beneath the surface. I would sit in the pews, listening to the pastor speak of us as God's children, yet I could never truly see my reflection in the holy figures we revered. It was a subtle alienation, a feeling of being a guest in someone else's spiritual home. I pursued a degree in history, perhaps to find a sense of belonging in the factual record that I couldn't find in the sacred art. I learned to trust primary sources, peer-reviewed articles, and the cold, hard logic of archaeological evidence. My faith remained, but it was compartmentalized, separate from the rigorous skepticism of my academic mind. That all changed on a Tuesday. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in New York City. The air was thick with the scent of roasted nuts and exhaust fumes. I was cutting through Times Square, a river of humanity flowing around me, my mind preoccupied with a research paper on post-colonial trade routes. And then I heard it. A voice, not amplified but possessing a raw, resonant power that sliced through the city's cacophony. "They sold you a lie," the voice boomed. "They gave you a blonde-haired, blue-eyed savior to keep you praying to your oppressor. But the book, the very book they use to control you, holds the truth of who you are." I saw him then, a man standing on a simple crate, dressed in a garment of purple and gold fringes. He was tall, with a beard that seemed to contain the wisdom of ages and eyes that burned with an unyielding fire. He held a worn, leather-bound Bible high in the air, not like a prop, but like a weapon. Around him, a small crowd had gathered, a mix of curious tourists, dismissive locals, and a core group of followers who nodded in solemn agreement. He was a black Hebrew Israelite, one of the street preachers I had always seen but never truly listened to, dismissing them as mere spectacle. "They tell you your history began on a slave plantation in Virginia," he roared, his finger jabbing at the sky. "But I am here to tell you your history is one of kings, of prophets. You are the true children of Israel. The blood of Jacob flows in your veins." My historian's mind immediately threw up a wall of skepticism. Romantic revisionism, I thought. A coping mechanism. But I couldn't walk away. His words were not just angry. They were structured, almost scholarly in their fury. "Open your Bibles. Don't listen to me. Listen to the Most High. Turn to Deuteronomy, chapter 28, he commanded. A few in the crowd rustled through their own Bibles. The God of Israel warned us what would happen if we broke his commandments. He laid out the curses that would befall his chosen people. Read them and tell me they are not the biography of the black man and woman in America." He began to quote, his voice a sorrowful cadence. Verse 32, "Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand." A hush fell over his small audience. The words hung in the air, heavy and chillingly familiar. He spoke of families torn apart on the auction block. Verse 48, he continued, his voice rising again. "Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger, and in thirst, and in nakedness, and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck, until he have destroyed thee." An image flashed in my mind, unbidden, a textbook diagram of a slave collar, the brutal iron yoke. It was no longer an abstract historical artifact. It was a biblical curse made flesh. My heart began to beat faster. The wall of skepticism was cracking. Then came the final, devastating blow. The preacher's voice dropped to an intense, focused whisper that seemed louder than his previous roars. And now, the prophecy that proves it all. The one they can't explain away. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. And he paused, letting the weight of the verse settle. The Bible scholars, the priests, the pastors, they will tell you this means a literal return to the land of Egypt. But our ancestors were not taken back to Egypt. The word for Egypt, Mizraim, means bondage, a house of suffering, a furnace of affliction. The prophecy states we would be brought into a new house of bondage, a new Egypt. And how? With ships. What people on this earth were scattered to the four corners of the world, put on slave ships, and sold to their enemies? What people fit this prophecy to the letter? The question was a spear, and it pierced straight through me. The logic was so simple, so direct. It was breathtaking. I stood there, frozen on the pavement, the city's noise fading into a dull roar. The preacher's words weren't just an echo in a concrete canyon. They were an echo of something ancient, something I felt deep in my bones. That night, I couldn't work on my paper. I went to my grandfather's old bookshelf and pulled out his Bible. The leather was cracked, the pages thin and yellowed with age. It smelled of dust and time. I had read it countless times, but tonight it felt like I was opening it for the first time. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the fragile pages to Deuteronomy. I found chapter 28, and I began to read. The words were no longer just ancient laws and warnings. As I read them under the dim light of my desk lamp, they transformed. They were a mirror, reflecting back 400 years of suffering, struggle, and survival. The yoke of iron, the children sold away, the strange tongue of the conqueror, and finally, the journey into a new Egypt, with ships. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a possibility so profound it shook the very foundations of my identity. My history didn't begin on a plantation. My faith wasn't borrowed. What if it was my stolen inheritance? Closing the book, I knew this was no longer an academic curiosity. It was a quest. I had to know the truth, no matter where it led. And I had a chilling, thrilling suspicion that the clues were right here, in my hands, waiting to be seen with new eyes. The silence in my small apartment was a stark contrast to the storm raging within me. The city outside hummed its relentless lullaby, but I couldn't hear it. All I could hear was the rustle of ancient paper and the pounding of my own heart. The words from Deuteronomy 28 were branded onto my mind, a chillingly precise prophecy that now served as my map. If the curses of the slave trade were foretold, then what else was hidden in these pages? What did these people, my potential ancestors, look like? The preacher had insisted the proof was there. I had to find it. My academic instincts warred with this new, fervent need for answers. The historian in me demanded context, linguistic nuance, and cross-referencing. But the man, the black man who had always felt a subtle disconnect from his faith's iconography, was driven by something more primal, a hunger for identity. My fingers, guided by a half-remembered Sunday school lesson, found their way to the Song of Solomon, a book of poetry, of love, of passion. I remembered it being controversial, its verses so intimate they made the deacons blush. I scanned the first chapter, my eyes darting across the familiar King James English until they landed on a verse I had read before but never truly seen. Chapter 1, verse 5. I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. The words leapt off the page. I am black. 4 simple words that detonated a quiet bomb in my soul. I read it again, slowly, tasting each syllable. The woman, the Shulamite, the beloved of King Solomon, was declaring her blackness, not as a flaw, but as a fact, followed immediately by an affirmation of her beauty, but comely. My mind, conditioned by years of historical training, immediately latched onto the next verse, a ready-made rebuttal. Verse 6. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. There it was, the out, the rational explanation. She's just sunburned. That's what a professor would say. That's what I should have thought. It was a simple case of a field worker's tan, but the fire lit by the street preacher was still burning. The phrase wasn't, I am tanned, it was, I am black. And she wasn't apologizing for it. She was explaining why her blackness was so deep and pronounced that it drew stares. I closed my eyes and tried to visualize her. The image that came to mind wasn't of a pale woman with a sun-kissed glow. It was of a beautiful, dark-skinned woman, her complexion rich like the fertile earth, explaining to the lighter-skinned daughters of Jerusalem why her skin was the shade it was. She was one of them, yet distinct. She belonged, yet she had to explain herself. A feeling so profoundly familiar, it made my throat tighten. This one verse wasn't enough. It was poetry, open to interpretation. I needed more. My search moved from the songs of love to the cries of sorrow. If the curses of Deuteronomy were the key, then the books of prophecy and lament that followed the fall of Israel must hold more clues. My fingers found the book of Jeremiah, a prophet of doom and heartbreak. I skimmed his warnings, his pleas, his condemnations, until I found chapter 14, a lament for a great drought. Verse 2. Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish. They are black unto the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. They are black unto the ground. Again, my academic mind whispered, it's a metaphor, Elias. It means they are grieving, sitting in sackcloth and ashes, their faces smudged with dirt. It was the logical, safe interpretation. But I couldn't accept it so easily now. What if it wasn't a metaphor? What if it was a double entendre, a description that worked on two levels at once? A people in deep mourning, a people whose natural skin color was black, collapsing in their sorrow. The image was powerful. A whole nation of dark-skinned people, their faces etched with grief, sinking to the earth in despair. My pulse quickened. The pattern was emerging. The descriptions of color were intertwined with the descriptions of suffering. I frantically flipped forward a few books to Lamentations, the raw, agonizing poem written in the aftermath of Jerusalem's destruction by the Babylonians, one of the historical curses. This, I felt, would be the heart of it. If the people suffered as Deuteronomy predicted, their appearance must be described here. My finger traced down the page of chapter 4, a description of the nobles who once lived in splendor. Verse 7 to 8. Her Nazarites were purer than snow, they were whiter than milk. Their visage is blacker than a coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It is withered. It is become like a stick, blacker than a coal. The words were stark, brutal. There was no poetry here, only raw, visceral description. The famine, one of the curses, had ravaged them, and in their suffering, their appearance became blacker than a coal. Then, chapter 5, verse 10, our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine. That was it. The connection was undeniable. The curse of famine, a direct consequence of their disobedience, had a physical effect that the prophet described using the color black. Their skin, scorched by the internal heat of starvation, became black like an oven. I leaned back in my chair, breathless. The Bible wasn't describing a temporary condition of being dirty. It was describing a people whose skin, when afflicted by suffering and heat, became profoundly and shockingly black. This wasn't a metaphor anymore. This was a physiological description, an eyewitness account of suffering that used the people's inherent color as its reference point. One final, terrifying question remained. If the Israelites were black, if the prophets were black, What about the Messiah, the central figure of my entire faith? With a trembling hand, I turned to the very back of the Bible, to the book of Revelation, the apocalyptic vision of the Apostle John. I found the first chapter, where John describes the resurrected, glorified Son of Man. I read past the description of his head and his hair, white like wool, and his eyes like a flame of fire. My own eyes locked onto verses 14 and 15, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. I read the words 3 times. Feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. I got up from my desk and walked to the small decorative bowl on my shelf, where I kept old coins and trinkets. I picked up a small brass medallion. It was a dull brownish gold. I imagined it being placed into a blacksmith's forge, heated until it glowed with a fierce internal light. What color would it be? It wouldn't turn white. It would darken, deepen, becoming a brilliant, smoldering, burnished bronze, a deep, powerful, radiant brown. I sank back into my chair, the brass medallion cold in my palm. The image of the Christ from my childhood church, the pale skin, the gentle, almost fragile features shattered into a million pieces. In its place rose a new vision, terrifying and majestic, a being of immense power, with hair like pure white wool, eyes of fire, and skin the color of polished brass heated in the crucible of judgment. A being who looked less like the paintings in the Vatican and more like the men I saw on the streets of my own city. I looked down at my own hands, at the back of my brown skin against the yellowed pages of the Bible. For the first time in my life, I saw not a contradiction, but a connection, a reflection. The quiet dissonance that had hummed beneath the surface of my faith for decades had gone silent. In its place was a thunderous revelation. The evidence wasn't just in one verse. It was a thread woven through poetry, prophecy, and apocalyptic vision, a thread of color, a thread of identity, a thread that was leading me somewhere both exhilarating and terrifying. My quest was no longer about proving a theory. It was about reclaiming a God. The days that followed were a blur of ecstatic discovery. The world felt new, repainted in vibrant colors I had never noticed before. The Bible, once a book of familiar stories and moral lessons, had become a treasure map, and I was the sole explorer on the verge of a monumental discovery. I walked the city streets not as Elias, the quiet history student, but as a descendant of kings, a hidden prince whose identity had been cloaked for centuries. Every face that resembled my own was no longer just a face in the crowd, but a potential kinsman, a lost member of a scattered tribe. The revelation gave me a sense of belonging so profound, it was almost painful. It was the answer to a question I hadn't even known I was asking my whole life. But I am a historian, or at least, I was training to be one. And the ghost of that training, the skeptical, methodical, evidence-based part of my mind, would not stay silent for long. It began as a whisper while I was rereading Jeremiah. Context, Elias. You are ignoring the literary context. I pushed it aside. It returned as I marveled at the description in Revelation. Symbolism, Elias. This is apocalyptic literature. Are his eyes literally fire? Is a sword literally coming out of his mouth? I told the ghost to be quiet. The ghost finally cornered me in my own fortress, my library. It was a Saturday morning. I had spread my notes across the dining table, cross-referencing verses, building my case with the meticulousness of a lawyer preparing for trial. My argument felt airtight, a perfect circle of prophecy, description, and fulfillment. But then my eyes fell on the bookshelf lining the wall, groaning under the weight of history tomes. My own books, the very tools of my chosen trade. The ghost whispered again, this time with an authority I couldn't ignore. You have other primary sources, Elias. You are cherry-picking your evidence. A real historian looks at everything. With a sigh that was half surrender, half defiance, I walked to the shelf. My fingers, almost against my will, pulled out a heavy, glossy textbook, Art and Empire, the Ancient Near East. I had spent weeks studying this book for a midterm. I knew its contents intimately. I let it fall open on the table, its pages parting to a chapter on the Assyrian Empire, and there it was. A 2-page spread of the Lachish reliefs. The image was a punch to the gut. It depicted the Assyrian siege of the Judean city of Lachish in 701 BCE. These were Israelites, my people, carved in stone by their conquerors. I leaned in close, my breath fogging the glossy page. The camera of my mind zoomed in on the faces of the captives. They were being led away, their expressions a mixture of terror and resignation. They had beards, intricately curled in the Semitic style. They had prominent, hooked noses. Their features were sharp, distinct, and they looked nothing like the people I imagined. They didn't look sub-Saharan African. They looked, for lack of a better word, Middle Eastern. My heart sank. This wasn't a European painting from the Renaissance, filtered through centuries of cultural bias. This was a contemporary depiction, an ancient photograph carved in stone. The ghost of the historian spoke, its voice now clear and cold in my head. This is what the people of Judah looked like to their neighbors, Elias. The Assyrians knew what Nubians looked like. They knew what Egyptians looked like. And this is how they depicted the Hebrews. Where is the face that is blacker than a coal? I slammed the book shut, a cloud of dust puffing into the air. The sound echoed in the quiet room. It was a childish, angry gesture. I was angry at the book, at the Assyrians, at my own education for complicating the beautiful, simple truth I had just found. I started pacing the room, my mind racing. It's just one relief, I told myself. Propaganda, maybe. The Assyrians could have carved them that way for a reason, but I knew it was a weak argument. I went back to the bookshelf, this time grabbing a dense academic text on Levantine archaeology. I forced myself to read, my eyes scanning the dry, scholarly prose. The words confirmed my fears. The modern racial constructs of black and white are largely anachronistic when applied to the ancient world. One paragraph read, "The peoples of the southern Levant, including the Israelites and Judeans, were a West Asiatic or Semitic people. Their physical appearance would have encompassed a spectrum of features and skin tones, likely ranging from light olive to dark brown, shaped by centuries of interaction with surrounding populations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. They were distinct from the Nilotic peoples of Nubia to the south, and from the Indo-European peoples to the north and west. The words were like sand in my mouth, a spectrum, not a monolith. My beautiful, simple truth was fracturing, becoming complicated and messy. The powerful binary of black and white, which had given the preacher's words such force, was dissolving into shades of historical grey. Defeated, I turned back to the Bible, seeking refuge. I needed to find a verse that would refute the textbook, that would silence the historian's ghost. I flipped to the story of King David, the greatest king of Israel. I found the passage in 1 Samuel where the prophet Samuel first lays eyes on the young shepherd boy who would become king. Chapter 16, verse 12. "And he sent, and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to." Ruddy. The word stopped me cold. I knew what it meant. In Hebrew, the word is admoni. It shares a root with the name Adam, and with the word for red earth, Adamah. It didn't mean sunburned. It meant a reddish, fair complexion, a healthy, Caucasian-like glow. David, the ancestor of the Messiah, the sweet psalmist of Israel, was described as fair-skinned. I collapsed into my chair, my head in my hands. The room felt like it was spinning. One book told me the Israelites looked Middle Eastern. Another told me their king was fair-skinned. And yet others told me their skin was black like an oven and blacker than a coal. The beautiful straight line from the preacher's words to my own identity had been twisted into a knot. The euphoria was gone. In its place was a profound and aching confusion. I was caught in a crossfire between two powerful narratives. One was the story of a stolen identity, a black heritage hidden in plain sight, a story that spoke directly to my soul and my experience of the world. The other was the story told by history, archaeology, and even other parts of the Bible itself, a more complex, diverse, and contradictory picture that resisted easy categorization. I looked at the two books lying open on my table, the Holy Bible and the history textbook. They seemed to be staring at each other, two titans locked in a silent, epic battle for the truth of my past. I couldn't go back to the man I was before that day in Times Square, but I couldn't ignore the evidence now spread before me. The quest was no longer about finding proof. It was about navigating a labyrinth, and I realized, with a growing sense of dread and determination, that the only way out was to go deeper in. The conflict within me was a quiet, grinding war. For weeks, I lived in a state of cognitive dissonance, a historian haunted by a faith that seemed to defy his training. I avoided the street preachers, fearing their certainty would either expose my doubts or reignite a fire I could no longer sustain with pure passion. I stopped reading the historical texts, unable to bear their cold, clinical dismantling of my newfound identity. I was adrift, caught in the currents between the rock of my heritage and the hard place of my education. One evening, unable to sleep, I found myself staring at the wall of my apartment, at a framed print I'd bought in a museum gift shop. It was a replica of a small section of the Rosetta Stone, showing the same text in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and ancient Greek. It was a monument to translation, to the cracking of a code that unlocked a lost civilization. And as I stared at it, a new thought, a new path forward, began to form. The battle wasn't between the Bible and history. The battle was about language. The street preacher, the scholars, myself, we were all reading an English translation of a book written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. We were interpreting words whose original meanings were buried under millennia of cultural and linguistic shifts. The preacher saw black and thought of race. The historian saw black and thought of a metaphor for grief. What if they were both missing the point? What if the original Hebrew words held a key that could unlock this entire mystery? The next morning, I didn't go to the library. I went to the university bookstore and, with a trembling credit card, purchased a beginner's guide to biblical Hebrew, a Hebrew-English lexicon, and a Strong's Concordance, a massive volume that assigned a unique number to every single word in the original text, allowing a reader with no knowledge of the language to trace its usage throughout the entire Bible. It felt like buying a set of ancient cartography tools to map a hidden continent. Back in my apartment, I turned my dining table into a linguistic command center, the air filled with the scent of fresh paper and ink. My first target was the word that had started it all, the one from Song of Solomon 1-5. I am black. I looked it up in the concordance. The English word black corresponded to the Hebrew word shakor, shakrafasari. With my heart pounding, I began to trace shakor through the Old Testament. The lexicon confirmed its primary meaning, black, the color. But as I followed the cross-references, a more complex picture emerged. Shakor was used to describe ravens, proverbs, horses, Zechariah, and marble, Esther. It was a literal color. But then I looked at the context. In Lamentations, where the people's visage is blacker than a coal, the word used wasn't shakor. It was a derivative of kadar, koder. This was a breakthrough. They were two different words. I dove into the entry for kadar. The lexicon defined its root meaning as to be dark, to be turbid, to mourn. It was used to describe the sky growing dark before a storm, the sun and moon being darkened during divine judgment, and, most frequently, the act of mourning. A mourner was one who was darkened. They would wear dark sackcloth, stop anointing themselves with oil, and their faces would become grim and shadowed with sorrow. Suddenly, the verses from Jeremiah and Lamentations snapped into a new, sharper focus. Judah mourneth. They are kadar unto the ground. Their visage is darker. kadar than a coal. The prophets weren't necessarily making a statement about inherent racial characteristics. They were using a powerful, evocative word that simultaneously meant to be dark and to mourn. They were saying the people's grief was so profound it had become a physical darkness upon them. It was a poetic masterpiece, a description that worked on both a physical and an emotional level. It didn't disprove a dark-skinned populace, but it showed that the primary intent was to convey an overwhelming state of suffering. The historian's ghost nodded in grim approval. But what about the Shulamite woman? She used shakor. She wasn't mourning. She was declaring a fact. I am shakor. This was a crucial distinction. The language itself was pointing to a diversity of descriptions. My investigation then turned to the most challenging verse. The description of King David, ruddy. The Hebrew was admoni, Eid. I looked it up. The lexicon confirmed its connection to red, or reddish-brown. It was used to describe Esau, Jacob's hairy red-complexioned brother, and a pot of red lentil stew. But as I dug deeper into the word's etymology, I found another layer. The root, Adam, didn't just mean red, it meant earth or ground. Adama was the reddish-brown soil of the Levant. A new image of David formed in my mind. Not a pale, rosy-cheeked European boy, but a youth with a vibrant, earthy, reddish-brown complexion, the color of the very land he came from. He wasn't white. He was the color of the earth. He was an earth-colored man. This simple act of translation completely recontextualized the description. The perceived contradiction between a black Shulamite and a ruddy David began to dissolve. They weren't opposites on a modern racial spectrum. They were two different descriptions of people of color living within the same nation. One was a deep, beautiful black. The other was a vibrant, reddish-brown. The Bible wasn't describing a monolith. It was describing a diverse, multi-hued people. Finally, with a sense of both dread and excitement, I approached the feet of the Messiah in Revelation, fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. I knew the Greek word was chalkolibanon. Its meaning is notoriously obscure, a word found almost nowhere else in ancient literature. Scholars have debated it for centuries, but the imagery was the key. I wasn't just a historian. I was the son of a man who worked with his hands, a mechanic who knew the properties of metal. I closed my eyes and pictured it again. Brass isn't an element, it's an alloy of copper and zinc. Copper is a deep reddish-brown. When you put it in a furnace, it doesn't just get darker. It glows. It emits light. The description in Revelation wasn't just about color. It was about luminescence. It described feet that were not only a deep, burnished brown, but also radiated a powerful, divine light, like metal in a forge. It was a description of glory, not just race. A glory so intense it manifested as a radiant, dark energy. I leaned back, the lexicon still open before me. The linguistic journey had done what no amount of historical debate or passionate belief could. It had provided a bridge. It revealed that the simple English words I had been fighting over were like flattened, black and white photographs of a world that was originally in vivid, complex color. The original Hebrew and Greek weren't hiding a simple truth. They were painting a rich, diverse, and nuanced portrait. A portrait of a people of the earth, in shades of rich black, earthy red-brown, and every hue in between. A people whose suffering could darken their skin like a stormy sky, and whose divine glory could make it shine like metal in a fire. The war inside me was over. A truce had been called. The historian and the believer could coexist. The quest had changed once more. It was no longer about finding my reflection in a single verse, but about seeing the tapestry of my ancestors woven through the very language of the text. The journey wasn't over, but now I finally had a compass I could trust. The linguistic truce brought a fragile peace to my soul, but it also opened up a new, sprawling frontier for my investigation: geography. The Bible wasn't written in a vacuum. Its stories unfolded on a specific patch of earth, a place that shaped its people, its politics, and its perspective. My New York City apartment, with its brick walls and view of fire escapes, felt 1,000,000 miles and 1,000 years away from the world I was trying to understand. I needed to see the map not as a collection of lines and names, but as a living, breathing landscape. I pinned a large map of the ancient Near East to my corkboard. It became the new centerpiece of my quest. The small, narrow strip of land labeled Canaan or Israel was squeezed into an impossible position. To its southwest lay the colossal, ancient power of Egypt, Mizraim, the heartland of an African empire. To its southeast stretched the vast Arabian desert, a corridor for trade and migration. To its north and east were the empires of Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, in what is now Iraq. Israel wasn't an island. It was the world's most critical land bridge, a divine crossroads connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. For millennia, armies, traders, nomads, and pilgrims had marched across its soil. The street preacher's argument had been simple: Israel is next to Africa, therefore the Israelites were black. It was an argument I had initially found compelling in its directness, but now, looking at the map, I saw it was too simple. Israel wasn't just next to Africa, it was the meeting point of everyone. To assume they were purely one thing was to ignore the fundamental reality of their location. My research shifted from lexicons to migration patterns, from biblical verses to trade routes. I learned that the relationship between Israel and its African neighbors was deep, ancient, and complex. It wasn't just a matter of proximity, it was a matter of shared history. Abraham, the patriarch of the nation, journeyed to Egypt to survive a famine. Centuries later, his descendants, the 12 tribes of Israel, would spend 400 years in Egypt, not as rulers, but as a subservient, growing populace. 4 centuries. What does that do to a people? They don't live in a sterile bubble. There is intermingling, intermarriage, the adoption of customs, and the absorption of people. I thought of Moses. The Bible says he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, Acts 7:22. He was raised in Pharaoh's own house. When he fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian, he fled to Midian in the Arabian Peninsula and married Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest. When his own sister, Miriam, spoke against him because of his wife, described as an Ethiopian woman, God's anger burned against her and struck her with leprosy, Numbers 12. The Hebrew word used for Ethiopian is Cushite. Cush was the ancient name for the powerful black kingdom of Nubia, south of Egypt. The future leader of Israel was married to a black woman, and God himself defended the union. This wasn't a footnote in the story, it was a foundational event. The leadership of Israel was, from its very inception, multiracial. The connections continued to pile up. King Solomon, whose lover declared herself black and comely, forged a powerful alliance with the Queen of Sheba, a monarch widely believed to have hailed from Ethiopia or Yemen. She came to his court not as a curiosity, but as an equal, a powerful ruler seeking wisdom and trade. The story ends with them exchanging lavish gifts, but Ethiopian tradition, recorded in the Kebra Nagast, tells a much richer story of a son born from their union, Menelik I, who would return to his homeland with the Ark of the Covenant itself, founding a royal line that saw itself as the true continuation of the House of David. I stared at the map, my mind reeling. The story I was uncovering wasn't about a black Israel replacing a white Israel. It was about a people who were profoundly and fundamentally connected to Africa. The African influence wasn't an anomaly. It was part of the nation's DNA. Then my eyes drifted south on the map, past Egypt, to the land labeled Cush, ancient Ethiopia, Nubia. I remembered a verse from the prophet Amos that I had glossed over before, but now it resonated with thunderous importance. God is speaking to the people of Israel, chastising them for their arrogance, for believing their chosen status made them inherently better than other nations. Amos 9-7. Are ye not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel? Saith the Lord. Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? I read the verse again, the words hitting me with the force of a physical blow. God himself places the Israelites on the same level as the Ethiopians, the quintessential black nation of the ancient world. Are you not like the Cushites to me? He asks. The question is a radical leveling of ethnic pride. He is telling them, your exodus from Egypt, which you hold up as the sign of your specialness, is no more significant in my eyes than the migrations of the Philistines or the Syrians. And your identity, in my eyes, you are like the Cushites. In that moment, the entire debate about race seemed to collapse under the weight of God's own perspective. The question wasn't whether the Israelites were black or white or ruddy. The point was that in God's eyes, their ethnic makeup was irrelevant compared to their spiritual covenant. He saw them, as he saw the children of Ethiopia, as his children. The geography had revealed a truth more profound than skin color. Israel's identity was forged in a crucible of nations. They were a Semitic people, yes, but a people whose bloodlines, culture, and history were inextricably woven with the peoples of Africa. They were a mixed multitude from the very beginning. The pure-blooded Israelite was a myth. Their chosenness was never about racial purity. It was about a divine calling. I leaned back, looking from the map on my wall to the Bible on my desk. They were no longer two separate sources of information. They were two halves of the same story. The land and the book were telling me the same thing. To understand this people, you have to understand their world. And their world was a crossroads, a melting pot, a place where the streams of humanity from Africa and Asia met and mingled. The image of the preacher in Times Square returned to me, his voice booming. He had been right that history was whitewashed. He had been right that a deep African connection had been severed from the popular telling of the story. But he had perhaps simplified the truth to fit a modern narrative. The reality was richer, more complex, and in its own way, more beautiful. The Israelites weren't a black people who had been forgotten. They were a crossroads people, a testament to a God who draws his family from every direction on the compass. And this realization felt like a homecoming far more profound than simply finding my skin color in a verse. It was finding my world in the Word. My quest, which had begun with a fiery street preacher's cry for a stolen racial identity, had led me to a place of unexpected nuance. I had discovered a people of the crossroads, a multi-hued nation whose identity was far more complex than modern labels could contain. It was a historically sound, theologically rich understanding. It should have brought me peace. Instead, a deep and unsettling sadness began to creep in. The historian in me was satisfied, but the black man living in 21st century America, felt a profound sense of loss. The revelation of a diverse, Afro-Asiatic Israel was intellectually honest, but it lacked the raw, empowering force of the story I had first heard. That story, the one where my ancestors were the literal, exclusive, and forgotten Israelites, had been a balm on a 400-year-old wound. It had inverted the narrative of oppression, transforming the chains of slavery into a mark of chosenness, the suffering of my people into the fulfillment of prophecy. It gave us not just a seat at the table of history, but ownership of the entire house. Now, that powerful simplicity was gone, and in its place, a question echoed in the quiet of my apartment. Why did that story feel so necessary in the first place? To answer that, I had to turn my historian's gaze away from the ancient world and onto my own history. A history not of stone reliefs and Hebrew lexicons, but of whips, auction blocks, and whites-only signs. A history where the Bible was not a tool of liberation, but an instrument of control. I thought of the slave Bible, a real, historical artifact I had studied, an edition of the scriptures published in the 19th century for use in the British West Indies. It was heavily redacted. It removed any and all passages that spoke of freedom, rebellion, or escape. The story of the Exodus, the single most powerful liberation narrative in human history, was gone. The promises of Revelation, of a new Jerusalem, where every tear would be wiped away, were excised. What remained was a rulebook demanding obedience. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. For centuries, my ancestors were handed a weapon with its firing pin removed. They were taught to revere a book that had been gutted of its power to save them, at least in this life. They were shown a pale, gentle, blonde-haired savior who taught them to turn the other cheek, to endure suffering patiently, and to wait for their reward in an afterlife their masters controlled. This Jesus looked like the overseer. This God sanctioned the master's authority. It was into this spiritual vacuum that the Black Hebrew Israelite movement was born in the late 1802, founded by men like Frank Cherry and William Saunders Crowdy. I began to research them, not as fringe figures, but as pioneers. These were men who, in the ashes of slavery and the dawn of Jim Crow, looked at the whitewashed Christ they had been given and said, "This is not our God." They took the weapon that had been used against them, reloaded it with the verses that had been stolen, and aimed it squarely at the heart of white supremacy. Their genius was in their reinterpretation. They didn't reject the Bible, they reclaimed it. They argued that the suffering of black people wasn't a sign of inferiority, but the ultimate proof of their divine heritage. Deuteronomy 28 wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was the key that unlocked their entire experience. It explained the middle passage. It explained the family separation. It explained the yokes of iron, both literal and metaphorical. It gave meaning to otherwise senseless, unbearable pain. Suddenly, I understood the raw power and allure of their doctrine on a visceral level. It was more than a historical theory. It was a profound act of psychological and spiritual resistance. In a world that told black people they were nothing, that their history was a void, this movement gave them a history more ancient and glorious than that of their oppressors. It told them they were not the cursed children of Ham, as slave-owner theology proclaimed, but the chosen children of Jacob. This was the source of my sadness. The need for such a story was born from an immense trauma. A people whose identity, language, and family lines were systematically destroyed will inevitably seek to build a new one. When your history has been erased, you will either invent a new one or, as the early Hebrew Israelites did, uncover one that has been deliberately hidden. The question of whether their historical claims were 100% accurate became secondary to the reality that they were addressing a 100% real, spiritual and psychological wound. I walked to my window and looked down at the street below. I saw the faces of the city, black, white, brown, every shade imaginable. I thought about the street preacher. I had initially dismissed him, then embraced him, then intellectually refuted him, but now I saw him with new eyes. I saw him as a spiritual physician, applying a radical, potent medicine to a sickness he saw all around him. Perhaps the medicine wasn't a perfect cure, but it was a response to a real disease. The disease of a stolen story. The tragedy was that in order to reclaim their own identity, some branches of the movement felt the need to exclude others. The idea that only black people were the true Israelites, that the people in the land of Israel today were impostors, that other races were inferior. These were the toxic byproducts of that same initial trauma. When your own humanity has been denied for so long, it becomes a terrible temptation to deny the humanity of others in return. It was a mirror image of the very racism it sought to fight. I realized my quest had been incomplete. I had been searching for the true identity of the ancient Israelites. But the more important story, the one that resonated with my own life, was about what happens when a people's identity is stolen from them. The result is a deep, aching scar on the collective soul. The Black Hebrew Israelite movement, in all its diverse and sometimes contradictory forms, was a testament to that scar. It was a cry of pain, a declaration of pride, and a desperate, brilliant attempt to rewrite a history that had been brutally written for them. My satisfaction with my nuanced, scholarly conclusion felt hollow. It was a truth of the mind. The Hebrew Israelites, whatever their historical inaccuracies, were speaking a truth of the heart, and I knew that to complete my journey, I had to find a way to honor both. The final phase of my journey was not one of research, but of reconciliation. My apartment, once a command center for historical and linguistic warfare, became a sanctuary for quiet contemplation. The map on the wall, the books on the table, the notes scribbled with Hebrew words, they were no longer pieces of a puzzle to be solved, but artifacts of a pilgrimage. I had journeyed from the certainty of a whitewashed faith to the fiery conviction of a reclaimed black identity, through the complex maze of academic history and into the painful heart of a stolen story. Now, I had to decide where to build my home. I couldn't go back. The image of a fair-skinned European Christ was forever broken. It was a historical fiction, a tool of empire, and it no longer had any power over me. The connection between the Bible and the peoples of Africa was too deep, too real, too divinely ordained to ever be ignored again. The blood of the Cushite wife of Moses, the wisdom of the Ethiopian queen of Sheba, the divine parallel drawn by God himself in the book of Amos, these were now permanent fixtures in the architecture of my faith. But I also couldn't fully embrace the doctrine I'd heard on that Times Square corner. Its power was undeniable, its critique of history essential, but its exclusivity, its need to draw a new racial line in the sand, felt like a repetition of the original sin of racism, just with the roles reversed. My journey through the text had revealed a God who consistently broke down barriers of blood and soil, a God who chose a mixed multitude to leave Egypt, who grafted wild branches into his olive tree, Romans 11, and whose final vision was of a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, Revelation 7-9. To claim this inheritance exclusively for one group, no matter how wronged they had been, felt like a betrayal of the God I had come to know. So, where did that leave me? It left me at the crossroads. It was the very place Israel had always been, geographically and spiritually. It was a place of tension, of diversity, of encounter. It wasn't a place of comfortable certainty, but of dynamic faith. And I realized that this was my true inheritance, not a specific racial identity, but a place at the crossroads. My personal no-face YouTube channel, once a dormant account with a few random travel clips, became my canvas. I didn't have the booming voice of the street preacher or the academic credentials of a tenured professor. I had a story. I had a camera, a microphone, and a stack of books. And I decided to tell my story, not as an exposé, but as a journey. I set up my camera to film my hands, the Bible, the maps, the historical texts. The no-face approach was no longer a YouTube policy to follow. It was a profound metaphor. This wasn't about my face. It wasn't about elevating myself as a new guru. It was about letting the evidence speak. It was about inviting people to look down at the text with me, to trace the words, to see the connections, to feel the weight of history in their own hands. My first video was titled simply, "Was History Rewritten? My Journey into the Bible's Hidden Colors." I began not with a declaration, but with the same question that had hooked me. Is there evidence of black Israelites hidden in the Bible? I walked the viewer through my own process. I showed them Deuteronomy 28, letting